Hi, welcome back. So the next topic which we are going to discuss is the data sources. In this topic, we are going to talk about what is the data sources, what is the purpose of the data sources, why do we need the data sources in Terraform, and how to use the data sources and how to write the data sources. We'll talk about what are the use case of the data sources in real-time environment where we use the data sources. So let's have a look. In data source, we'll talk about the overview of data source. Then we'll talk about the data source references, where to refer and how to refer the data sources. We'll talk about the data source dependencies, similar to the resource block. We do have the dependencies in the data source as well. And then we'll talk about the data source meta arguments, similar to the resource block. We do have some meta arguments with the data sources as well. How we use them, how we configure those data source meta arguments. This is something we are going to talk about. Let's start with the overview. So the first thing, why do we need the data source? And what is the purpose of the data source? We know when we are writing the resource block, those resource block is creating the resources into the Azure through the Terraform. That is the purpose of the resource block, right? So what is the purpose of the data source? The purpose of data source is to manage the resources which was not deployed through the Terraform. So let's assume I have some resources which I didn't deploy through the Terraform, but I want to refer those resources into the Terraform for the resources which I'm going to create through the Terraform. So in that case, I can use the data sources. I can refer those existing infrastructure which I didn't deploy through the Terraform through the data source. So basically data source is reading those data or reading those resources in Azure, which we already deployed either through the manually or PowerShell script or something like that. And we can't destroy and recreate those resources, and we don't want to manage those resources through the Terraform due to so and so reason, right? So this kind of a resources, but I wanted to consume or I wanted to integrate those resources with the new resources which I'm going to create through the Terraform. So this kind of a resources I can call through the data source. So I can read through the data source. So with the help of the data source, I can read those resources and I can integrate those resources with the new resources I'm going to create through the resource block. One of the best example is I don't want to manage the keyword and the secrets through the Terraform. And the reason is whatever I am creating into the Terraform, they are in a plain text, right? So if I'm creating a secret through the Terraform, that secret will be in a plain text format in my configuration file. Then I'll have to make sure that configuration file is secure. I'll have to manage it in a way that it is secure and not everyone has the access to that configuration file. I don't want this. I want to create the secret maybe manually or PowerShell script or in another way where it will be more secure than the Terraform. Okay. So what I can do is I can deploy the keyword and the secret manually, maybe through the portal or the PowerShell script. But I wanted to use that secret. Maybe I'm creating a virtual machine and I wanted to set the administrator password of that virtual machine through the secret. So what I'll have to do is I'll have to create the keyword and the secret manually. And in the Terraform, while creating the virtual machine, I'll have to use the data source for the keyword. Similar to the resource block, the data source is also comes up with the provider itself, and every provider has its own data sources and different data source types. So we can use the keyword data source, we can read the keyword, and then we can read the keyword secret data source, and we can read the secret data of existing infrastructure which we didn't deploy through the Terraform. Okay, so that is the main purpose of the data source. We can manage or we can read the existing infrastructure through the data sources. And data sources can read the data of existing infrastructure and can utilize for the infrastructure which we are going to manage through the Terraform. So that is the purpose of the data source. We'll see in the next section how we write the data sources and how we refer the data sources in a different resource block or the data block itself. Okay, so let's have a look how to write the data sources. Similar to any other block in Terraform, we have to start with the block type. And for data sources, the block type is the data. Then we have to write the provider data source type. Similar to the resource block, we do have the different data sources for each provider. So if I'm using the AWS, then based on the services available in the AWS, I'll have the different data source type for those AWS services. So they are depends on the provider, what provider I'm using, the data sources are going to be changed. You can follow the documentation of the Azure provider to see like what kind of a data sources available to read the existing services in Azure through the Terraform. The next thing which we have to write is the block name. So similar to the resource block, Here also in the data sources, we have to write the block name for the data block. Okay, so these are the three things which we have to define or we have to write to complete the data source or data block as a start. And then we have to write the curly braces open and the curly braces closes similar to the other blocks in the Terraform. Then once we have written this data block type and then the provider data source type and the block name, based on the provider data source type, I'll have the different arguments which I'll have to put into this data block, so I can read the data from the existing resources which I do have in my Azure environment. For the keyword, I'll have to put the name in the resource group. So based on the name in the resource group, which I'm going to put as a argument over here in the data source block, it will find the resource group, or it will try to find. If it found that particular resource, then it will take the detail of that particular resources taking into the consideration. So whenever I wanted to refer that particular data source block into the any other resources or anything, I can just simply call this data block and use the property which I do have with this particular keyword resource. So simply this data source block will read the property of the existing resources which we didn't deploy through the Terraform. If we would have deployed through the Terraform, then we will have a resource block and then we can just simply refer the resource block which we did into the implicit dependency section. So we can just simply call one resource block to the another resource block to refer it. But here, if we didn't deploy the resource through the Terraform and we wanted to use that particular resource, then we can just simply read the existing environment with the data source block. And to write the data source block, we have to write the block type, then the provider data source type, then the block name, curly braces open and the close, and then the arguments depends on the provider data source type, which may different. But in case of the keyword is the name and resource group name. Most of the cases it is name and the resource group name, but in some cases you might have some more arguments. Okay, so that is how we write the data source block, and we can also use the meta argument similar to the resource block in the data source. So we can use the count and we can use furthermore data source arguments what we saw in the resource block as well. So count is the meta argument in this section or in this block. So this is what the data source is. This is the overview of the data source. Why do we use the data source? I have explained, and how to write the data source. So now let's have a look to the data source references. Data source references, we have written the data sources in last section. So how to use that or how to consume that data source to deploy a new resource or to configure a new resource or to integrate with a new resource which I'm going to deploy through the Terraform. Because the keyword which I am using through the data source, it was not deployed through the Terraform, and that's why I'm using data source to read the data of that keyword or to read the property of that keyword. So let's have a look how we do the data source references. So let's assume I have a resource group which I didn't deploy through the Terraform. I'm just taking this example just to make sure like it's a simple example and we understand it more. And when we do the practical, we do the lab session, that time I'll show you maybe a little more complex scenario to use the data sources. But for now, to understand it, I have a resource group which I didn't deploy through the Terraform, but through the manually. And the resource group name is the network RG. So I use the data block for to read that data source or to read that resource group. So I can use and I can deploy my network security group into that resource group. Okay. So what I have to do is I have to write the data block. Similarly, what we have seen in the last example, the block type, provider data source type, which is Azure RM resource group in that case, and then the name of the block. And I put the name as a network. You can use whatever the name you want, except those reserved name or reserved letters, which we can't use. So network is fine. You can use the network. And then for the resource group type, you don't have to define the resource group name. You just have to define only the name as a argument. And you have defined name is equal to network RG. Okay. Now, this is my data source. Now I wanted to use this data source or this resource group, and I wanted to deploy a network security group underneath of this particular resource group, which I didn't deploy through the Terraform. Okay, so I call it through the data source. I read it through the data source, and then when I'm deploying this network security group, this is how I can refer it. Okay, and if you have seen this, this is something we used in the implicit dependency of the resource block as well, right? But here we have a little bit different. So if you remember in the resource block dependency or implicit dependency of the resource group, we have used Azure RM resource group .network.name directly. We didn't use the data in front of it. So when you are deploying the resources through the Terraform and you want to refer that block, that resource block, then you can directly use the provider resource type dot block name and dot argument, whatever the argument you want to use. But if you are reading the data block or if you are referring the data block, then you have to use the data dot the provider data source type, then dot block name, which is network in my case, and dot location of the resource group. Okay, and similarly for the resource group name, I use the data dot provider data source type dot block name and dot name. So this is how we refer the data sources in Terraform. And this is how we call the data sources. So that is the purpose of the data sources in Terraform. And when we do the lab session, I will show you more complex scenario. And one of them we already discussed in the overview, that we can use the keyword or we can deploy the keywords manually and the secret manually, just to make sure we are not putting the secret value in plain text. Because if we are creating the secret through the Terraform, then we have to put the value in plain text in the Terraform. There are some way which we can use to make sure we are not putting it into the plain text, but somehow it is going into the plain text in the state file, which we are going to talk about. Just to prevent that thing, what I can do is I can deploy the keyword and the secret manually, and through the data source I can call them and I can integrate it with my Terraform code which I'm using to deploy my resources. Like I wanted to use the virtual machine admin password, and password is in the keyword secret, so I can read the keyword and then the secret, and then I can use the reference into the virtual machine to make sure that secret value has been used as a password of my virtual machine. So that is one of the example. There are more examples which we can see in the lab or in the lab section. And when you are going to work on the Terraform in the real time, you will find more use cases where we can read the data of the data through the data sources in Terraform and integrate with the resources which we are going to deploy through the Terraform. So that's all about the data source and the data source references. Now let's have a look to the laboratory section or the practical way. I'll show you some more complex scenario where we are using the data sources. So in this video, we are going to talk about the use case of the data source and in the practical way, how the data source is working and how we are calling the existing resources in our Azure environment and referring it to somewhere in the Terraform code. So as I already explained, the data source is basically reading the property of existing resources, which we are not managing through the Terraform. But we want to use it, we want to integrate it with our Terraform code. And we still don't want to manage them through the Terraform itself. That's why we are using the data source block, which is basically reading the property of those existing resources. So in our project, what we are going to do is we are going to create this VPN gateway, and while creating the VPN gateway we have to pass a shared key, and shared key is basically a sensitive information. So what I want is I want to create or I want to store that sensitive information in a keyword. So for that purpose, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a keyword which I already created, and I'm going to create a secret underneath of that keyword which I'm going to use to store the key. Now the question is why I'm not creating this keyword through the Terraform. So let's assume if I'm creating this keyword through the Terraform, and if I'm creating the VPN shared key through the Terraform or this secret with the Terraform itself, then I'll have to pass the value of that shared key in my configuration file, right? If you just have a look to the Terraform Azure keyword secret, then you can see we have to, when we are creating or when we are using the secret, we have to pass the value of the secret, not here, the value. So whatever the sensitive value, you have to pass into the plain text. This is not something I want, because I don't want to pass or I don't want to keep anything sensitive or anything like password or something like that in my configuration file. So due to that reason, I don't want to manage my keyword and the secret through the Terraform, but I want to use this value. So for that purpose or for that reason, what I could do is I can create the keyword manually in the portal, but I wanted to use the value in my Terraform while creating the VPN. So for that reason, I'm going to use the data source of to achieve this requirement or to fulfill this requirement. I'm going to use the data source, which is going to read this keyword secret value. So let's have a look at how the data source for this keyword secret looks like. So what I'm going to do is I'm again going to do Azure Terraform keyword secret. But if I do just this search, then it will show me the creation of the secret, but I wanted to use the data, so I'll just put the data on top of that. And here I can see the data source for the keyword secret. And for the data source of the keyword secret, I need two arguments, name of the secret and the keyword ID. So I'm not managing the keyword either, so I won't be able to find the ID. So in that case, what I can do is I can have the another data source for the keyword itself. So first I'll have the data source for the keyword, for which I have to pass the name and the resource group. So I'll just copy this one and I'll go to my code. I'll put it here, and the keyword is in the hub. So I'm going to put the hub keyword. Name of the keyword I'm going to use. The name of the keyword I do have. Then I'll pass it over here. If resource group if we want the implicit dependency, then we can use the implicit dependency here as well, because we know the resource group is there. So either we can use it something like this, or if you want, you can just copy and paste the name of the resource group. So I'll just put the implicit dependency, but that is not required because it's a data source and the resource group is already been created. So keyword was created manually, and that means the resource group was already there. That means it was already created. So I don't want any dependency, but if you don't want to write the name, then you can also just copy and paste the resource group name. And the next one which I'm going to use is Azure RM keyword, and that is again the benefit of the Visual Studio Code and the extension. And VPN shared key, it would be, I know I'll have to provide the name. So name of the secret is VPN shared key. I'm going to copy and paste it over here. Then keyword ID. Now I do have the keyword ID, but to refer the data source, it's slightly different than the reference of the resource block. So in the reference of the resource block, we directly use the resource block name and the reference of the resource block and the location. But in the data, you have to explicitly put the data, then dot, then your keyword block name, and then your dot, your reference here, dot reference, and then dot ID. Okay, so this is how I'm going to use the data source. And if I run the Terraform apply command, okay, I do have some issue. Okay, the issue is I don't have the name correctly here because I made some mistake in the copy and paste. So I'm going to use something like this. I do the Terraform apply again, and now let's have a look. So the expectation is it should only read the data, and that's why if you run the Terraform apply command, you will get the output no changes, because there is no changes. We are just reading it. We are just reading the keyword and secret. We are not making any changes. So it is only reading that, and if you can see here in the apply output, it is reading your data block. It is reading the information of the secret. And when I'm running the Terraform apply, it will not do anything. It is not making any changes, but I just wanted to make sure the data block is executed successfully. So what I'm going to do is either I can use the output block, which we are going to talk about in the next section, or if you want, like the correct value of your shared access key was stored or called in your Terraform, then let me show you how we can verify it. So I'm going to see my value, that is password at the rate 123. It's a dummy value, so don't worry about it in my case. So it's password at the rate 123, and now I just wanted to make sure that this value should have output of this one should have the password at the rate 123. So if I wanted to use, I can use it, or if I wanted to see, then I can just go to the state file where I do have all my information, and I can see the value here. So that means the value has been successfully called. And don't worry about this state file thing. I'm going to explain it, why we do have this plain text value in the state file and how to secure it. And that we do have a separate whole section for this state file explanation and everything. So don't worry about it. Just to showcase you, the data source has been successfully executed and read the property of the value from the Azure. I just wanted, I use this state file example. So you can see the value was successfully called from the Azure. And that is the example of the data source block. So hope you enjoyed it. If you have any question, you can put your question in the comment of the video, and I'll try to answer it as soon as possible. And I'll see you in the next one. Thank you. Hi, welcome back. In this section, we are going to talk about the data source dependencies. Similar to the resource block dependencies, we do have the dependencies in the data sources as well. So let's have a look what type of dependencies we do have in data sources and how to define those dependencies. So if we talk about the dependencies in data sources, there are two types of dependencies, implicit dependency and the explicit dependencies. Similar to the resource block, if we are referring one data source into the another one, it will be the implicit dependency. If we don't have any common property and we wanted to make sure that one data source is depend on the another one, then we can configure the depends on is a explicit dependency. So let's start with the implicit dependency. Let's assume I have a data source for the resource group and the resource group name is the network RG. So I have written the data sources similar to what we have seen in the last section, the block type, provider data resource type, block name, and then the name of the resource group. Now I wanted to make sure this resource group or this particular data source have the dependency or should the network security group which we are going to call as a data source should have the dependency on this resource group. Why? Because we know this resource group is what or where we do have the network security group. So what we could do is first we read the resource group and then we read the network security group and use the property of the data source for the resource group. Okay, so here in this case what I want is I want to read the resource group first and then I read the network security group of that resource group which is reside in that particular resource group. So to read the network security group, what I have to use as a argument is the name and the resource group name. So here in the resource group name, I want a reference or I want an implicit dependency. So before reading the NSG, Terraform should read the network resource group first. Okay, and to define that implicit dependency, similar to what we did in the resource block, we have to define the data is a type of the block data, then dot, and then provider data source type, the name of the provider data source type, and then dot again, and then the block name, that is network in our case. And once we are done, what we want here, we want a name, we want a resource group name. So we call it the resource group, but we have to mention which property or which argument you want to read from that data source. So I wanted to read name. So this reference is basically an implicit dependency. So whenever Terraform is reading the data, it will read the resource group first and then only it will read the NSG because we are referring the resource group into the NSG. And unlike the resource group dependency or implicit dependency of the resource block, here we are defining the data in front of the provider data source type. So this is what the implicit dependency is. If we are defining the implicit dependency, then or if we are referring the implicit dependency in the network security group of the resource group, then it will read the resource group first, then only it will start reading the NSG of that uh, energy which is reside into that particular resource group. So this is how we define the implicit dependency in the data sources. It is similar to the resource block dependency. If you haven't seen the resource block dependency session yet, so just go and watch it and you'll get more understanding why we are using the implicit dependency. Because with the resource block, it makes more sense about the implicit dependency because where we are in the resource or in the resource block, we are deploying the resources. Here we are reading the resources, but there we are writing or deploying the resources. So defining the dependencies and the references are more important into the resource block. Okay, so that's all about the implicit dependency. Let's have a look how we define the explicit dependency. Let's assume I do have a resource block and the data source block. So the resource block is to deploy the subnetwork, and I do have the data source block which will read the NSG which resides into the network RG resource group. I wanted to make sure only after the subnet one is deployed, then only the data source should start reading the NSG. Okay. By default, they don't have any common properties. They don't have any implicit dependency. Subnet one is totally different from the NSG and data source of the NSG, and data source is not dependent on the subnet one. There is no implicit dependency. There is no dependency, and by default, we know Terraform do the this kind of a execution in a parallel way. But in my case, I wanted to make sure only after the subnet one is deployed, then only the data source should be executed. So what I'll have to do is I'll have to use the explicit dependency, and to use the explicit dependency, I'll have to use the depends on meta argument similar to the resource block. Okay, and I'll have to write the depends on meta argument in data source equal to and then the square braces because it's a list and it can be dependent on multiple resources, but in my case it's just one. So I'll define the resource block type and then I'll put the block name. Now if I execute the code, first it will deploy the subnet and then only it will read the data from the NSG. So this is how we define the explicit dependency. There are some use cases of the explicit dependency, but in data sources, mostly we are not using the explicit dependency. Most of the time, we are either using the implicit dependency or we are not using the dependency at all. But in resource block case, the dependencies are very important because where we are creating the resources, here we are just reading the data. We are not creating or we are not updating the resources. Here we are just reading the data. So though we do have some use cases to use the implicit and the explicit dependencies with the data sources as well. So this is how we use the implicit and the explicit dependencies in the data sources. So that's all about the data source dependencies. Now let's have a look in a practical way how we use the data source dependencies and what are the use cases we do have with the data source dependencies. So, so we talked about the implicit and the explicit dependencies for the data source. And you can already identify that this implicit and the explicit dependencies or dependencies for the data source are the same as what we used to have in the resource block. So I'm not going to spend time on it because we already talked about it, we already discussed about it in the resource block, and the similar way we do have here. Only the difference you have here is the data dot. This is something you have to add. And in the last data source practical section, I already showed you the implicit dependency of the secret or the keyword on the secret. So I need the ID of the keyword, so I have to use the implicit dependency here. The only difference we do have in the implicit dependency of the data source and the resource block is we have to prefix it with the data dot. Unlike the resource block where we don't need anything, we can just simply use the resource block name and the type of the resource block and the name of the resource block, and in the data we have to put the data and then the similar way we can call it. So this is how we can use the implicit dependency. And if we talk about the explicit, similarly you can put the depends on and then again the data dot whatever the reference you want, and then you can use the ID or whatever, or not the ID but the name of the block itself, and that would be your external dependencies for the data source. So those are the same things, same properties, same output, same way and same purpose. So if you want, you can use the implicit dependency in the data source and the explicit dependencies also with the data source, and you could do the cross as well. Like if I want a external dependency of a resource block, then I can do the resource block external dependency in my data source block. So that is also possible. So that's all about the dependencies of the data source. So if you have any if you still have any question, or if you have anything comes in your mind about the dependency of the data source, you can put it into the video as a question and I will try to answer it as soon as possible. Hi, welcome back. In this section, we are going to talk about the data source meta argument. Similar to the resource block, we do have the meta arguments in data source as well. This is something we have seen in the data source overview as well, that we can use the count in the data sources. We can use the depends on in the data sources. So let's have a look what kind of meta arguments are available for the data sources. So for the data source meta arguments, we do have similar to the resource block, we do have the life cycle, depends on, provider, count, and for each. We don't have the provisioner with the data sources because when we are going to talk about the provisioner, I'll let you know why we don't have the provisioner with the data source. But rest of the data source meta arguments are the similar to the resource block meta arguments. Similar to the resource block lifecycle meta argument, we do have a couple of flags with the data source meta argument as well, especially the lifecycle. So we don't have the long list here, but we do have the precondition and the post condition with the life cycle as well. So let's have a look. Similar to the resource block, we can write the life cycle as a sub block in the data source, and then we can provide the argument and value. And in the life cycle of data source, we can use the precondition and the post condition. So precondition is again, it will read the data source in the, like it will check the condition in the plan itself, and post condition is it will check the condition only after applying the changes. So here we are not making any changes, we are not updating anything, we are just reading the data. So we can put some conditions for the precondition or the post condition in the data sources as well. Maybe we can check something like if that condition is true, then only you should read the data, or if that condition is true, then only you should complete or reading the data. So we can use the precondition and the post condition based on our requirement as a lifecycle meta argument in the data sources. Next thing we have the depends on. We already saw it in the explicit dependency section that we can write the depends on, or we can use the depends on as a meta argument in the data source block as well. Okay. The next one is the provider, similar to the resource block. We can read the data from the multiple subscription using the provider. This is something we saw in the provider multiple areas configuration or multiple provider configuration with the areas. So if I'm using the multiple providers, then I can read the data and I can define in the data block which provider or which subscription I should consider to read the data. So if my resource group one is in the spoke subscription, then I can use the provider type and then the areas of the provider, and then I can read the data from that subscription. So I can read the data from multiple subscription using the multiple provider, and I can use the provider as a meta argument in the data sources as well. So that's all about the provider, and similar to the resource block, we are going to talk about the count and for each in our Terraform expression section. So both are the similar, both are the same. Why we are using, what is the purpose of count, what is the purpose of the for each? So we are going to talk about in the Terraform expression.